Okay, it looks like we have a critical mass of people to get started, and as folks are still joining and trickling in, welcome to the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative Winter Webinar Series. This is the first of four. My name is Jamie Ellis, and I work as the Natural Areas Coordinator at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And I am part of the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative advisory team. The Prairie Reconstruction Initiative, let me move, there we go. The Prairie Reconstruction Initiative is a community of prairie practitioners and researchers from more than 30 organizations with support from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, working together to improve the practice of prairie reconstruction. Our mission is to build an engaged community of practice who work together to overcome uncertainties through all phases of prairie reconstruction. We envision prairie reconstructions that are biologically diverse, ecologically functional, and resist invasion by non-native plants. We focus our activities on evidence-based tools and peer-to-peer learning. We have developed a prairie reconstruction vegetation monitoring protocols and built a prairie reconstruction database. By pooling and analyzing data from many reconstructions, we hope to reveal pivotal elements that will increase the likelihood all reconstructions meet expectations. Our learning opportunities include both in-person and online events where the PRI community can exchange experience and knowledge with each other. We believe these insights from both individual experiences and scientific investigation lead to our collective success. So just a little bit of housekeeping for this webinar. Cameras and microphones will be turned off during the presentation. So please type questions and comments for the speaker in the chat, and then and at the end I will give folks the ability to unmute themselves if you would like to ask a question directly. And of course, then we'll get to all questions and comments at the end of the presentation. And just as a reminder, this session is being recorded, and we do plan to upload it to our YouTube channel, and we'll let folks know when that happens. So. And now I am very happy to introduce our speaker for today. Ferin Davis Anderson is the Natural Resources Manager for the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux Community's Natural Resources Department and co-author of Wildfire, The Culture, Science, and Future of Fire, a book exploring the science of wildfires, the history of fire in the United States, and the relationship Indigenous people have with fire. Ferin is an enrolled citizen of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa in North Dakota. Ferin is responsible for stewarding and restoring natural areas for the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux Community. She works to weave Indigenous knowledge and Western science to practice holistic land stewardship. This includes using fire as an ecological and cultural tool to achieve beneficial and healing outcomes. Witnessing Indigenous people revitalize and reconnect with this practice has been one of the greatest gifts of her career. Ferin was also part of a team that helped bring bison back to the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux community, a relative that will help the community connect with the land and their culture. And Ferin, thanks for being here. I will stop sharing my slides so that you can start sharing your slides, and the presentation is yours. Thanks again.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Can you see my presentation fine?
I see it. We can get some thumbs up from people if they, yep, okay. It looks
lots
like
of thumbs up. Good, good start. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for having me here. So I'm going to start with a traditional protocol greeting. Buju and Dinaway Magnaduk, Anin, Ferin Davis Anderson, Indigenous, Mikanak, Wejui, and Dunjiba, Si Pasing, and Dunji. And what I said there was, hello, all of my relatives. My name is Ferin Davis Anderson. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, Anishinaabe, Michifs in North Dakota. That's where I grew up and went to school, high school, and college. We have a tribal college there. And I'm also from Belcourt, North Dakota. That's where our reservation is located. All right, let's get into it. So I wanted to briefly go over some of the information about the tribes in Minnesota, because I'm always surprised at how many people don't realize how many tribal communities we have in Minnesota. And so Minnesota Makoche is the homelands of the Dakota people. There are 4 Dakota communities in Minnesota, and Shakopee is one of them. And we're all located along the Minnesota River. And we also have 7 Anishinaabe or Ojibwe tribes up in northern Minnesota. And we all have our own tribal governments. It's important to note that there are over 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States, and we're all unique. We all have our own governments, languages, cultural teachings, and origin stories. But we do have similarities within some of our worldviews, but we should not be viewed as a monolith. And I think that's important to remember. And even within our own communities, we don't always agree with one another. Sometimes, I don't agree with what my uncle's telling me, but they're your family and you have to be with them. So I wanted to let people know that, the Dakota and Ojibwe nations of Minnesota, we began signing treaties in 1805. And I think a lot of people get hung up on that word treaty. And what that basically meant was that we made some concessions of land for specific uses. And the United States government was supposed to provide some things for us. So we received money, goods, and various promises for education and health. And so in 1805, the Dakota people seceded area around what's currently Minneapolis, or the Fort Snelling area. And then in 1858, the Minnesota statehood came about. So in between that 50-year period, there were a lot of treaties that had been signed, and even some afterwards. And I want to talk about the Dakota War that started in 1862, and that was brought on by a lot of broken promises to the Dakota people for food that was never delivered. And so there was a small group of Dakota people that rose up in arms, basically, and that's what led to the Dakota War, because those promises were broken. And there's also there was a Dakota Expulsion Act in 1863, and that's a federal law that's actually still on the books. And basically, it was it got rid of all of the Dakota treaties, and it also made it illegal for Dakota people to live in the state of Minnesota. And so Dakota people, our treaties and our treaty rights after that were gone, unlike the Anishinaabe people. But then, the United States kept small parcels of land for some of the Dakota people that were, I guess, quotations friendly. And so that's why we have these smaller communities that you see along the Minnesota River. But that Expulsion Act, it actually applied to all Dakota people, regardless of if they joined the war or not. And it's still on the books today, even though it's something that is kind of confusing. Why is that still a law, and why is it still technically illegal to be Dakota in the state of Minnesota? All right, next slide is a little bit about the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux Community. So the community was federally recognized in 1969, and we started with a little less than 250 acres, so a really small area for their people. And today we have over 6,000 acres, so we've grown exponentially. And over 1,000 of those acres have been reconstructed to prairie or other fire-dependent habitats like oak savannas. And we've also started reconstructing some maple basswood forests because we're located in the ecological section called Bigwoods. And so maple basswood forests were common in this area, and along with the oak savannas and prairies that were abundant along the Minnesota River. And they can still be found there today, but obviously some are degraded and some have gone to the wayside. So it's important to note too that Scott County is one of the fastest growing counties in the state of Minnesota. And there's a mix of commercial, industrial, and housing development in this area. And so the community has dedicated a lot of resources to providing opportunities for their community to access and have access to natural areas, because we've seen the area being developed around us. And so if we don't have these spaces, there's lost opportunities to revitalize those cultural practices that the community depends on, and they won't have an opportunity to, you know, build those reciprocal relationships with the land unless there's areas to go to. And so that's what I wanted to talk about today, reciprocal restoration. And sometimes when I talk about that, I think, well, what does that mean? What is reciprocal restoration, and how can we include that into the work that we're doing with prairies and prairie reconstructions? And so in Western science, right, there's a lot of people being outside of these, being a threat, or humans being viewed as a threat to ecosystems, right? And so for me and for reciprocal restoration, you know, people in these spaces are interconnected. And we got to remember too that these spaces evolved with you know, my ancestors and people that were living here long before Western people or settlers came here. And so when there's some restoration or reconstruction that happens on the land, that's also a restoration of our culture, because we're repairing these ecosystems that can contribute to cultural revitalization. And so if you've ever read Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, she does a beautiful job of explaining, you know, how we have our Indigenous worldview about how we have relationships with things on the land that we wouldn't necessarily think as being living beings, right? So like that plant in that picture there, you don't think of it, maybe that's your relative, right? And so that's something that we need to, I think, begin incorporating into our restorations, as acknowledging that these plants are relatives, and that, you know, we have a responsibility to take care of them. Because I was told by one of my elders that if you don't acknowledge plants while you're out in a space, and you don't acknowledge them as beings, they're going to think that we don't need them anymore. And so we need to be able to go to these spaces and say, and develop our relationships with them, right? And so that they know that they're needed on the landscape and that we want them to be there. And so that's what the Wamakashkan is in the Dakota language. There's not really a word for plants or animals. It's Wamakashkan, and that means living beings. And so we want to bring back all of those living beings in this area, and that helps us with our cultural revitalization, and to be able to practice things that we were once able to practice before settlement. And this is an example of that. So many of you probably know this plant. It's called prairie turnip, and it's one of the plants in the prairie that are found in usually drier areas. And it was a staple in the Dakota people's diet, and it was one of the most nutritious plants you could find out on the prairie. So we wanted to be able to have that relative back here in the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux Community, because currently most of our members have to travel pretty far distances to be able to harvest this sustainably. And, you know, we do have it in areas around Minnesota, but it's not as prevalent, and it's often in areas that harvesting isn't allowed. And so, again, people shouldn't be separated from that community. A lot of these plants co-evolved with harvesting, and that should really be part of our management, right? And so how can we incorporate that into how we're managing areas? Is it, you know, and a lot of people are thinking about that too, I think. And I've talked to, you know, people from the counties, people from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, a lot of different agencies that are realizing, okay, we need to allow harvesting in these areas. And, you know, it can be done in a sustainable and ecologically beneficial way. So yeah, we were able to bring back this relative to the community. That lady in the picture there is named Cindy Milda, and she was able to show us how the plant looks. That's, you know, step one, right? Is being able to identify this relative. And so if you don't ever see it, how are you going to be able to understand its benefits? And so we found this plant, and she showed us how that she harvests typically. And there's a couple different views from Dakota people on how you should try to reestablish it or sustainably harvest. So some people think that, you know, you put the seed head back down into the soil, and others I've talked to, they think that you should have it upright too. And so you're harvesting the tuber part that's underground. And so Dakota people, they have figured out how to harvest this sustainably and then make sure that populations come back in the future. And it's actually a plant that does really well with harvesting, and it thrives in that system too. So it needs some type of disturbance too, and it likes that. It also has a really hard seed coat, so it's hard to get established in prairie reconstructions. It needs some type of stratification. So fire is really good. You know, bison hooves might be something else we think about, or, you know, doing it yourself in the oven, or, you know, scratching or nicking a part of that seed coat, because if you're just throwing the seed out, it really doesn't establish well. And so again, this relative needs our help to come back to these spaces. Another relative that we've been able to bring back to the community is the Pate or the Tatanka. The reintroduction of bison here has been a really great opportunity for our community members to reconnect with a part of their culture that was taken. We got to think that their story, it really mirrors the story of the Dakota people too, right? These relatives are violently taken from the landscape, you know, for a variety of reasons, right? There was a systematic approach by the United States government to get these, to get the bison off the landscape for, you know, a variety of reasons. And one of them was to be able to, you know, keep Indigenous people in certain areas or keep Indigenous people out of certain areas. And so we wanted to bring these relatives back because they're such an important part of the Dakota people's lives. So, right, there was a connectedness of a lot of things. So they relied on bison for food, for shelter, for cultural and ceremonial purposes. And I read somewhere that people that relied on bison as a staple in their diet were actually, I think it was like up 6 inches taller than other Indigenous people in like the United States that didn't rely on bison. So you can see that it was obviously a really nutritious source of protein there. And the quality of life that our people had by being able to rely on this relative was really high because they provided so many gifts. And so one of those gifts was their grazing and how they had the dynamic in the prairie, right? And so that was also, you got to think, when these bison were taken from the landscape, that was devastating ecologically too, because these relatives, these plants that had co-evolved with bison, all of a sudden they were gone. And so I think it's, we all know that bison and fire are important aspects of prairie management. And so how can we do more to try to either mimic or get these beings back on the landscape? I think it's really important. And even trying to just understand or relearn that relationship through introducing fire and grazing. That's something that we're going to try to incorporate here at Shakopee, is using, now it's called patch burn grazing. And so that's something in the Great Plains that term is used a lot, and in Minnesota a little bit, but you don't hear about it as often. But it's something that, our ancestors were doing, and they understood the effects of introducing fire to certain areas to get these ungulate species to entice them to go to certain areas and to use it for our benefit in hunting. And so we were using patch burn grazing before it was called that, right? And so we're hoping to mimic that here and seeing how our plant relatives respond to that. Today, I also wanted to talk about fire, one of my favorite topics here. And so the community introduced fire back in the 1990s, after we did our first prairie restoration. And so at first, fire was reintroduced here through prescribed burns. But our ancestors, they had a cultural and spiritual connection to fire. So we thought that fire had a spirit. And so I've had elders tell me too that, fire can be both destructive and really beneficial. So there's, renewal with fire, and there can also be, devastating effects. But how do we balance that, and how do we live with fire in a good way? And one of those ways that we can start to do that is to acknowledge, again, the power of fire and the spirit that fire has on the landscape, because it's our responsibility to, again, foster that relationship and bring fire back in a good way to the landscape. So again, we had a connection with fire, and we use it in many different ways. And I have a short list on the slideshow there, but a lot of times we were using fire to stimulate native plant productivity. We used it because we understood that plants respond really well to that disturbance. Another reason was really a practical, right? Our people are really practical people. So it was easier to travel in certain areas. I don't know if you see understories in forests today, and oftentimes they're really thick with understory, and that wasn't how they were when our people were managing them, because we wanted to make travel easier for ourselves. Like, even deer can't move in that, and they say like, oh, this is really good habitat for deer. It's like, well, is it really? Because they can't even really move in this area. And so we used fire to make traveling easier for us, and again, to persuade game species to new areas, to clear campsites, and then for ceremony too. So in the early 1900s, when settlers were coming over, they saw us doing this practice, and they didn't understand why we were using fire. And you got to think, in Europe, it was probably something that was viewed very negatively, because fire could be devastating, because it could take out your crops, could take out your home, your, buildings. And so when they came here and they saw us using fire, they're like, oh, this is no good. We need to stop this fire, and we need to make it illegal for people to use it. And there's actually examples of that documented here in Minnesota in 1835 at Fort Snelling. And it was from Major John Bliss. I'll just read something that he said. I have ordered the Indians in the most positive manner not to set fire or permit their children to fire the prairie on any account, for it is sure to burn up the fencing, wood choppings, haystacks, and again, the cattle suffer, and horses, and the game is once driven off to a great distance. And so clearly, Major John Bliss didn't understand why the Dakota people were using fire. And I want to distinguish the differences between cultural fire and prescribed burning today, because today there's a lot of prescribed burning going on. I mean, we can always be doing more of it. There is a deficit that seems impossible to catch up, especially in the United States. We have all this fuel on the landscape that, is accumulation of policies that have been put in place by the United States government to ban or to put every fire out that starts. So we've been using prescribed burning to try to help with that. But there's a difference between prescribed burning and cultural fire. And I think you can see from the images there that cultural fire is more cyclical, right? It's a sacred practice. It's something that's done within your community and with your family. And I don't know if any of you have been on a prescribed burn, but you're often working with people that you've never met before. And so in a cultural fire, we're bringing our community together, and our children are involved, and our elders are involved. And in prescribed burning, that's often not the case. It's very hard usually to have an elder or your child on a burn because of these qualifications that you need to be on the fire line. And so prescribed burning is very hierarchical, and it's part of the incident command system. And there's, again, a lot of qualifications you need to be a part of that usually, especially if you're part of a state agency or a federal agency. And then prescribed burning is often used for fuel reduction, right? Which I think is kind of funny, because anytime you do any type of burning, you're going to be reducing fuel. So we should really be thinking about how we're using fire, what is it benefiting, and how is it affecting the plant, how is it affecting the animals, rather than just how is it reducing fuels. And then another important thing is how we're burning with these two different practices. So in prescribed burning, we're often using drip torches, which are really fun. And I don't expect anybody to stop using drip torches. I love using drip torches. But in cultural fire, thinking about natural ignition sources. So what would my ancestors have used to start a fire? And I really thought about that when I was in California a few years ago at a cultural fire training with a group of women in California who were reintroducing fire to their communities. And their elders had thought about, okay, how is this drip torch fuel, because it's off fuel in a drip torch is usually gasoline and diesel mixed. How are those fuels impacting the plants? And I hadn't really ever thought about that before. But yeah, how are they impacting our relatives? Because they thought those materials that they're using are used for baskets. And so how are their basket materials being impacted by the fuels from the drip torches? And how can we maybe use different materials to start our fire? And so when you're using natural ignition sources, you have to be a lot more thoughtful, I guess, or methodical, because drip torches, something at that training too that was talked about, is that they're really powerful. And I hadn't thought about that before either, but they really are, because if you're using it in a way, you can really get ahead of yourself in a short amount of time if you're putting too much fuel on the ground. And so with a natural ignition source, you have to really think about, okay, I'm not going to be able to have a constant fuel source on the ground. So how am I going to light this in a way that keeps the fire going? And so you have to be a lot more thoughtful. And maybe that's something that other practitioners want to include in how they're lighting their prescribed burns. So to talk about our prairie reconstructions here in Shakopee, I guess we're switching gears a little bit. We've restored over 1,000 acres, and those purple polygons are some of the areas that we've restored. I just wanted to show this nice dashboard that we've created documenting our prairie restorations over the years. And so our first restoration was in 1999, and we've continually added acreage throughout the years for the last 20 years. And so that's something that the community is really invested in, is, again, having these spaces so that we're able to reconnect and bring people out and harvest and provide opportunities for practices that, again, we're taking. And then here's an example of what you can do with the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative data that you collect. And so again, being a good relative is understanding how your relatives are doing, right? And so in prairies, one way you can do that is to monitor the vegetation. And so we've started monitoring our vegetation a few years ago using the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative protocols, and that's the nested plot and meandering surveys. And so we're able to create this Prairie dashboard to visualize some of that data and then display some of the metrics that we're able to get from collecting that data. And so we're not just anecdotally saying, oh, you know, this prairie looks really great. We can have this information to make, again, more holistic management choices, because if you don't understand how your prairie is doing, or you're just like observing it every once in a while and not taking any conclusive data, it's kind of hard to determine what's the best course of action, right? And how we manage that, how often we're burning, how often we should be interseeding maybe, or adding things to the prairie. And so this area is our buffalo pasture. And so we were able to see how many species we have there, what the diversity is. We're able to garner some of the C values from the species, and it's also we have a nice management timeline, so it kind of shows how often that area has been burned, and then how often we've added some things. So planting enhancement is we've interseeded some areas, and we've also planted some plugs in some certain areas. And then here's a plot that shows all of the species that we found in that pasture, buffalo pasture, that our bison are in. And it's just the number of occurrences of each species. So you can see that Indian grass, there's a lot of Indian grass out there. And then we coincided that with the C values. And so you can kind of get a nice visual of like, okay, what's the species makeup, and what does that look like within this prairie? Another thing that I like to collect data for is during our prescribed fires, because a lot of times when you're doing prescribed fire and you're trying to determine how well that fire helped the landscape, it's a lot of anecdotal stuff again. And so some visualization, some pictures, things like that. But there's this open source DIY Arduino data logging system that we've adopted here, and I found out about this system, I think, at a range management conference. And Devin McGranahan, he works for the USGS now. He created this open source software and then hardware to be able to record fire flame temperatures in that system. And so on the right, those pictures are just the boxes, the data logger boxes. And then that picture on the left there is how it looks out in the field when it's set up right before you're going to conduct a prescribed burn. And that's really interesting to just understand how hot some of your fires are getting, right, in certain areas. So you can set up these little monitors in your prairie before a prescribed burn, and you can get some real data from these areas. And that's something that I like to incorporate, so that, you know, not only do I understand like anecdotally how the prescribed fire had gone through this area, but now we have some other things that we can look at. And then this is a prescribed burn record dashboard that we created, and it's just had the last 2 years in it, because that's when we started it. We could add some other years from previous prescribed burns that we've done, but this is just showing where we were burning in the last 2 years, and then where those little red icons are where we put our fire monitors. And so we like to set them up in at least 2 of our burns per season, because when you're doing a prescribed burn, there's a lot of moving parts to it. And so sometimes putting up something else or adding something to your plate can often can be cumbersome, but I feel like it's worth it just to get the information that you want and to understand like how the fire might be affecting the plants on the landscape. And so those are some of the metrics we collect. So like, what's the temperature when we start the fire? What's the average relative humidity, average wind speeds, time it takes to burn a unit, and then the average staff that we have on each burn. And so the time it takes to burn a unit, I feel like even that really doesn't depend on acres. Even if you're burning, you know, a 140 acre field and a 20 acre field, it seems like it takes the same amount of time for some reason. I don't know if it's like that for anybody else, but for me, it feels like that. And so I'm just trying to understand how we can get to more areas with the limited amount of time we do have in our seasons for burning. And then from that fire logger, this is the graphs that you can generate from that monitor. And so you get your rate of spread, which is really interesting when you're thinking about prescribed fires. You can, you know, measure that out in the field, but then you can compare that to this monitor. So at these two different locations, one of the rate of spreads was 3, and then at the other logger, it was 4. And then it tells you the max temp. So when the fire is hitting your logger on that one side, the max temp on the logger number 1 looks like it's about 650 degrees Celsius. And then at logger 2, it looked like it was about 500 degrees Celsius. And that was in an area that we had burned last fall. And so one way that you could use this data was that, for say you went back afterwards and you looked at your vegetation, one of the things that we wanted to set back in that area was Siberian elm. And so we can go look at the elm this spring and see if there's a lot of resprouts, and then look at how hot the fire got. So in this area that the elm were, the fire was about 650 degrees Celsius. And if there's not a lot of resprouting, we can say, okay, that maybe when we did the fire, it was a good time to do it. So we did it last fall, so fall season. And then we did it when the RHs were actually a little bit higher than we normally like. They're in the high 50s. And so if it was something where we're seeing that there's resprouts and we didn't get, you know, set back the Siberian elm like we like to, maybe we would want to try a different season or seasonality of burning. Because when you're burning, again, and just like anything in you know, ecology, if you diversify when you're burning, or you're not burning the same time every single time you're burning, you're probably going to get better management, right? Because you're targeting different species and you're targeting different seasonalities that will help with setting back some of these things that you might want to set back, like Siberian elm. And so if the Siberian elm was coming back and you had a lot of resprouts and you saw like, okay, 650 degrees Celsius didn't really do anything, maybe you want to burn it when it's hotter and drier. So these are just, again, things to help you make decisions when otherwise something you wouldn't otherwise have, right? And I think that's all I have. I wanted to give a shout out to my book, Wildfire, The Culture, Science, and Future of Fire, which is available on Learner Books. The reason why I wanted to be a part of this book was because it's targeted to 8th grade to 12th grade readers. And I really wanted to have it focused on that age category because it was something that I had never really learned about when I was that age. So I don't remember learning about wildfires or the importance or anything when I was in high school. And so if we want to build a culture of acceptance around fire, and we want people to understand that fire is a part of the landscape, fire is something that is beneficial, fire is something that is needed, we need to start having our children understand like, okay, this is part of life and how are we going to live with fire in the future? Because we all know that fires have just be like an example is in Los Angeles this year. It's just becoming something that's so devastating. How can we change that? And how can we start to live with fire and understand that we have to reevaluate and redevelop our relationship with fire, because if we don't, it's just going to be devastating how like it is in California. And so I think right now it's really important. That message is really important, and we need to try to get it out as much as possible with as many avenues as possible. And I'm working right now on creating curriculum for this book. There is a reader guide available that's free on the website too for teachers. But we're working on curriculum because in the state of Minnesota, there's a mandate that's come down that teachers have to include some Indigenous knowledge within their lesson plans for different ages. And I've heard that it was really difficult, or teachers are having a hard time trying to figure out how they can incorporate Indigenous knowledge into science. And I thought that was really interesting because I consider my relatives really the first ecologists, because you got to think that what are the foundations of ecology? And that's basically the interconnectedness or the relationships in an ecosystem, right? And so my ancestors knew that, and they knew that everything was interconnected. And if something is done to something, there's going to be an effect on something else. And so that intergenerational knowledge is important. And I think it's really easy to incorporate our knowledge into science because there's a lot of parallels and it complements each other really well. And this is an example of how they can incorporate our knowledge into their science curriculum. And hopefully more to come with that fire knowledge and our cultural fire knowledge in the Midwest, because unfortunately, a lot of our knowledge in the Midwest around cultural fire has been lost because of colonization and, the United States government trying to assimilate our people into Western societies. And so we weren't able to pass down a lot of that knowledge to one another because, again, that practice was criminalized and we couldn't do it. Our families could go to jail if we wanted to teach our children how to burn on the landscape. So it's a lot of going to the communities and understanding where we are and where we're at within our communities and what knowledge our people still have. And we can still learn from the land, right? And so it's something that we can work together even with our non-native people to understand how cultural fire can be brought back and how the land can teach us, and how we can incorporate that into our everyday lives too with fire. And I think that's all I have. If you have any questions, or if you think of anything after this, there's my email, my phone number. The SMSC Native Green site is just a website that the community has that highlights some of the projects that we're working on. Yeah, so that's all I have. And again, thank you for listening, and thank you for inviting me to speak with the PRI. I'm excited. Thank you.
Well, Ferin, thank you very, very much. Folks can type into the chat. And or I have taken the muzzles off so you can unmute yourself or turn on your camera if you want to watch directly. Oh, Megan makes a comment. Farron clearly winning at the dashboard creation. So those visual representations of your data and what you're doing is amazing. And of course Ian Lane with the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative was working on some dashboards. So in 2 weeks we'll hear an update from Ian about that. And then yeah, Molly makes a comment. 10 acres and 100 acres, when it comes to fire, takes about the same time. And I'll echo that as well. And I've made those comments to people, whether it's 10 acres, 100 acres, it seems to take about the same amount of effort. So, okay, Amanda, you want me to read this for you? Thank you so much for sharing your perspective. Can you talk a little bit about how your community thinks about backfire versus headfire? And also, I think I missed it, but approximately how many people participate in the burns?
So that's a really interesting question. Right now, through prescribed burning, so again, there's a difference, right, between prescribed burning and cultural fire. I think that once we start implementing more cultural fires, that'll be much more with a backfire, right? So that would be something that is much less intense and something that will be easily manageable. And it's more wildlife friendly too, right? You're allowing animals to be able to escape. And so right now we do use headfire, but a lot of times we're using that is for time constraints because we don't have enough staff to be able to get to the area that we want to get to. There's always another unit that we want to burn. And so I think there's ways and things that you should understand about backfires and headfires and the amount of intensity you want. So if it's something that, maybe a headfire is something you need because you just need to get through it really quickly. But backing fires are probably what is going to be utilized when we're doing more cultural fires.
I'll just follow up with the question I jotted down. Who's on your crew? Do you have staff, volunteers, community members?
Oh yeah. So on our crew currently, we have our staff in the natural resources department. We have 8 people who actually have their red cards qualified so they can participate. Because on tribal land, it's unique that we're also federal land. So we have to have those qualifications to burn, which is actually a barrier to cultural fire. Because if we want our elders to participate or our children on these federal lands, we technically have to have them taking pack tests, and that's not something that we're going to do. And so that's something maybe in policy that we need to change to be able to, build capacity to have more good fire. And we don't maybe need these qualifications to burn because again, the land will teach us, we'll have these areas and systems in place where we can do cultural fires within our communities. But currently we have, again, staff from the Natural Resources Department. We have a public safety department too, and some of those folks are structural firefighters and they help us on our burns. And then the Bureau of Indian Affairs also has trust responsibilities to help us with fuel reduction and prescribed burning, but we do it mostly for habitat management. So we're a little different than some other tribes. And
Okay,
then it's been
oh,
cool because, sorry, the last couple of years I've been really pushing to get more community involvement in our fires. So a lot more community members have been interested even in getting their red cards. So I'm looking forward to having more community participation even on our prescribed burns.
oh, that would be amazing. I didn't realize about that little wrinkle of tribal land, federal land needing that
Mhm.
red card certification. Thank you. Ryan writes for practitioners looking for additional resources to learn about cultural habitat management and ways we can incorporate these ideas. Do you have any recommended sources to start with?
Yeah, so there's the cultural plants, culturally significant plants book that Lower Sioux has. That's a really good resource. It tells you some of the uses and Dakota names for plants. I think that's a really good resource to have. As far as like, how can I incorporate more people into my management? Maybe that's something you want to think about, and maybe allowing harvesting or creating harvesting events for specific uses for different plants. Learning the uses of plants again is you're you're figuring out what the relationship is with that plant. And so there's I think that's a cultural practice, is if you're building that relationship, learning as much as you can. I like to know, the Anishinaabe words, the Dakota words, for plants, because a lot of times our language is very descriptive. So you learn a lot about why those plants are in certain areas, or why they're there for just because of the name. And so there's a Dakota language app that actually has a lot of plant species in it, and I can share it in the comments, or Megan will probably know what I'm talking about. But even if you search the scientific name in that app, it comes up with the Dakota name. So I think that's really cool. And then Glyphwick actually has a lot of really good resources too on their website. So that's
Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission.
Yep.
Okay. Julia writes, thank you so much, Ferin. And this is similar to the last one. What suggestions do you have for restoration ecologists, land managers, especially who work for federal, state, public agencies who are interested in land rematriation? How can the restoration community support the land back movement?
I think that's a relationship really with the tribes, right? And so it has to be a conversation that started with the community. So like, I like to think that you need to have a relationship with the tribes to begin having that conversation. So just reaching out and saying like, hey, is there any how can we support you? How can we learn about what you're doing? I think that's really important, because sometimes when I get inquiries about things, there's a lot of assumptions made about what tribes' capacities are or what they're doing. And so instead of, making a lot of assumptions, you can just reach out and ask, hey, can I learn more about your programs or what you're doing at the tribe? And then maybe that is an area where you can start broaching and fitting in, and because a lot of our goals and objectives are the same, right? A lot of I'm sure like every single person in here that I talk to, we'd probably have really similar viewpoints of some of the things with prairie management, right? And so it's just conversations that you need to start having with people.
Thank you. Dan writes, have you seen a difference in spring fires versus fall fires in controlling woody vegetation, small trees and brush?
I would say that we have more success with fall fires controlling some of those woody vegetation areas. I think it has a lot to do with how fast your rate of spread. And so in fall burns, a lot of times your rate of spread is a little bit slower. And so maybe that residence time on the growing parts of the plant is a little longer. Whereas in the spring fires, your vegetation is usually more cured depending on, the season. Like especially this last spring, I think it was really wet. So it might not apply when it's really wet, but like it does get pretty dry in the spring, and then you have the fires and the rate of spread's a lot higher. And so the fire isn't staying on the woody species as long. And so I think that has a lot to do with woody vegetation control in the spring. We should be doing more summer fires. Any other questions?
Hi, Ferin.
Ferin,
It's
this
Amanda.
is-
Oh, good.
Oh,
Megan.
go ahead, Amanda.
ahead,
Same
Megan.
time we were counting to like 25. We were like waiting for somebody else to say something.
You owe each other a Coke.
So I was just curious, you mentioned cultural fire. Like, what are do you have ideas for how we can overcome? I know this is like the big weighty question, but how do we overcome some of these certification barriers to encourage cultural fire across the landscape? And is like, who should be leading that effort? Like, how can we be a good partner and participate in a good way without leaning into appropriation?
That is a weighty question. So right now there are a lot of policies on the federal level that don't allow for cultural burning in a community setting, and tribes are getting around that in certain ways, right? And so, yeah, like Molly's saying, making Minnesota a right to burn state. Yeah. So like not having liability be so heavy on the burn boss of that site, right? And so if something goes wrong and you followed everything in your prescribed burn to a T, and something happens, that person's liable for any damages that happen. So that's scary, right? So that could be one way. But on a federal level too, just talking to your legislators about maybe how could we, because there's a lot of talk already about, well, there was a lot of talk about how we can incorporate more fire on the landscape. But that is something that the conversation needs to continue. And one of the ways that we can build capacity is allowing more cultural fire and cultural burning on federal lands too. But like in the meantime, if you have a site that, isn't a federal or state site, thinking about how, because Indigenous people have relationships with those areas too. And so is there opportunities for us to burn in these spaces? And then again, that's an opportunity to learn from the land, to be able to burn in spots that, maybe don't require these qualifications, but are in need of fire too. Anything else? Otherwise, I'm leaving. No, I'm kidding.
Ferin, it's Amanda again. Thank you so much. I just got a text from Jamie. His internet went out on him, unfortunately.
Oh, no.
I know. But we are coming right up to the top of the hour. And so if anybody has a last question for Ferin, please jump in. Otherwise it was really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective. I really appreciated it.
Thank you.
All right, I'm not hearing anybody else, so thank everybody. And we do have the next 3 Wednesdays, we have more presentations. So look forward to having everybody back.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good afternoon. See ya.